If you ever wanted to learn how to build a natural looking vivarium and or paludarium, you do not want to miss this two-part video series. I'm going to show you in detail how I built this realistic looking vivarium and how you can do the same very easily. Welcome to Reptiles Crossing. My name is Lorenz and I hope you enjoy this video. We're starting this project by working on the future background. Here you can see I have glued together two of these styrofoam boards because I couldn't find any that were big enough in one piece, so I had to glue them together overnight. And I just used two bar clamps that I had left from some woodworking projects, and then I put some weight on them as well. But you don't need these clamps. You can use like books or any other heavy objects, basically just pushing it together, letting it dry overnight. You can use some foam glue, or you can also use aquarium safe silicone to glue it together. It doesn't have to be super strong, just holding together for now, because later you will put some dry lock on it, and after that it's basically glued together just by the dry lock itself. But yeah, essentially this is how we start. For the next step, I'm going to take some measurements. I'm starting with the PVC pipe, and to find out the diameter, I'm just guesstimating here at about 2 inches. And I'm using this pipe to later run my quartz from the waterfall through it. But this pipe is going to be installed directly onto the glass using some spray foam. So I have to subtract the width of the pipe from the future width of the entire background. Now that I have marked where I need to cut, I'm going to show you two ways on how to properly cut styrofoam. So you can either use a box cutter or a sharp kitchen knife for the first method. I'm using this leveling tool, but any guide, any metal, straight metal guide, or even a wood piece or anything really that is straight can be used. And basically you're just pressing down on the styrofoam, and then you are just running the blade through, but you're not going too deep. So every time you pass the knife through, I would say maybe a third of an inch deep. So it will take a couple passings, but eventually it will go through it. And once you get towards the end, you can actually just break the last piece off, as it will snap right off, and I'll show you that right here. So we cut about halfway through, and then you can just break it off. And in this case, I didn't really need a perfectly straight edge because this is the side where the pipe will be spray foamed later. So I didn't really bother getting a perfect straight edge. But as you can see with this method, you're getting a lot of styrofoam all over the place, and it sticks to your shirt, to your hands, really anything around you. So this is definitely not the method I suggest, but it is a method that works if you don't have the tool that I'm going to show you in the next step. And this is the tool I actually suggest using to cut foam. It's an electric foam cutting tool or hot wire, and you can find these for about $20 to $30 online. And basically it is a handheld device, and it heats up very quickly, a metal rod at the end, and there's a couple usually in the kit. And some are longer, some are thinner, some are thicker, and there's a really big one on the bottom as well. But anyway, it heats up, and you will have no styrofoam flying around, and it's going to cut it very precisely and very easily. And just like the box cutter method, I marked where I wanted to cut the styrofoam. I put my metal guide rod down, and I'm going to do some shallow passings through the styrofoam. In this case, I really recommend using something made out of metal because this wire does get very hot. You do not have to do very shallow passings, actually, as I figured out later, because the entire wire is hot. You can just cut all the way through. You just have to go a little bit slower. But you can cut it all the way in one cutting. And what I suggest is doing this in a well ventilated area, or maybe even outside, just because of the fumes that come from the styrofoam, and it smells very, very bad. But you'll see it snaps right off, it's clean, and there's no styrofoam flying around. The tank that I'm using is an 18 by 18 by 24 inch high Exoterra, And if you're keen on a front opening tank and you're building a vivarium or paludarium, then exoterras are the way to go, because they allow you to have several inches of water in them while also being front opening. They have ventilation from the front and top, and they're just overall built very well. I got mine from a local reptile shop for $120, and I think that was a fair deal. And so you really can't go wrong with these. You can use old aquariums as well, but they're only front opening, which makes everyday procedures a lot harder. And here in this process, I'm placing it down on an old moving box, because this way I can just easily rotate it around without scratching the glass or even worse, breaking it. And because I'm not just building a background, but also one side wall as well with some spray foam, I'm going to place the future background in the tank, and I'm going to mark with a line on how far I can go with the spray foam so that the background still fits in later. And as you can see, it's not a snug fit, and that is on purpose because there's going to be some water in there. So I cut the background purposely short, and on the side that was facing up, it wasn't snug there either. That's because that is the place where the pipe will go later. As you can see, I did tape off the part where I drew a line with the marker to know how far I can go with the spray foam. But I'm actually not recommending the step, just because if there is going to be some spray foam on this tape, it's actually a lot harder to remove it later. So don't bother, don't do this. Just draw the line and that should be good enough. Just know that this I'm using great stuff. I think it's called Gaps and Cracks spray foam. It's about $3 or $4 per can. I only used one can for this entire project, but depending on how much you're building up or how much background you're working with, you might need 2 or 3 cans. But please note that even as you can see, it comes out very thin. It will actually expand. It's expanding foam, it's in its name, and you should calculate for that. So don't go all the way to the line, just leave about an inch or so, and you can fill that in at the end as well. And what I'm doing is I'm just putting down a thin layer. This Gaps and Cracks recommends not going thicker than 1 inch, and then it should dry within 8 hours. If you do go a little bit thicker, which you can, I've done it in certain spots and it still dries, but it needs more time. So you might have to give it a full day in order to cure properly, to be able to later cut it without actually running into any gooey substance within the core of the foam. And in this step, I'm using a cork bark or cork round in this case. And I'm just going to place it where I want it. So again, what is now the bottom will later be the right side of the terrarium. And I'm just placing it into the foam. I figured out before where approximately I wanted it, so I remembered the placement, and I'm just going to stick it down. And then I'm going to put more foam around it. And let me tell you, this great stuff really sticks well after the 8 hours. It's going to be really solid on the glass, even if you would think, you know, how can great stuff adhere to glass? But just trust me, it does. I'm using some tape. It's actually painter's tape. I would probably suggest using something stronger than that, but it will do the job. But you need to use, if you want to put it in an angle, you will need to use some tape or something to hold it up and in the position that you would like it. So in this case, I'm just using some painter's tape, and it does not look professional at all, but it does get the job done. So and in about an hour or 2, the foam is actually cured enough that the tape would probably be could probably be removed, but I just left it in the entire night. And yeah, I was pretty much happy here with the placement. I'm going to plant a little bromelia inside of that cork piece later, so that's why I wanted to get the angle right here. But I'm going to use some more great stuff. Guess I spilled some there on the right, but I'm going to use more great stuff here, and I'm going around, and like I said, this forms a little bit more than an inch thick. But I wasn't too worried about it because I knew after this I'm going to let it cure until the next evening, anyway, because I couldn't work on it earlier because of work. So I wasn't too worried about it. I just filled in the other gaps that I found, and I didn't want to do the entire side wall either. I just felt that with this shape, so that you could still look into it a little bit from the right side of the tank, I was going to be happy, and this is how I left it. Next up, I'm going to work on the background, and I have these two biodegradable planters here that I'm going to glue to the backdrop with some spray foam so I can plant some plants on the backdrop later. However, I do not recommend these biodegradable ones. The only reason why I'm using these is because I had them left over from my spring gardening, and usually if you buy plastic ones, you have to buy them in bigger quantities, like 20 to 50, and it was just a waste of money to me because I only needed 2. So I thought I would give this a try. Worst case, if they rot away, the shape would remain due to the spray foam, so I wasn't too worried about it. But you know, I would highly recommend using plastic ones. It's just, you know, overall it lasts longer, but it works. So far I haven't had any issues with these in the long term. You do need to remember that when you use the spray foam around these cups, to leave the bottom pretty much open, or at least a hole in there. If you for some reason block the hole, it's okay. You can just use a drill later to drill a hole in there, or a couple holes, because water needs to be able to drain. If your plants just stand in water all day, they will eventually die. So keep in mind, you will need a hole or a couple holes in the bottom for the water to drain. And I used the spray foam. I did a little bit of an overhang, I guess you can call it, so that you cannot really see the underside of the planter. Also, these do not have to be completely straight. As you can see, I put it in at a little bit of an angle, and the plant wouldn't really bother so much. Now obviously you don't want to have it at a 90-degree angle where the entire soil is going to fall out, but a little bit of an angle is okay. You can even have it you know, overhanging forwards or towards you a little bit. That's totally fine as well. Whatever you can really come up with. And here I'm just spraying a little bit more foam randomly on the backdrop because I want this to be a 3-dimensional backdrop later. I'm not going too crazy though, because I will be using the hot wire tool as well to carve further into the styrofoam, so to give it even more depth. So I'm just using this. My original plan was to build a little, I guess, perch for my future animals to, you know, climb up and sit on. I planned on having a little cork bark leading up to that perch, and then they can just sit on there. I ended up scrapping the cork bark up there. I still have the perch. I just don't know if the animals will be able to reach it. But either way, you can just use this to make some 3-dimensional pieces. As you can see, you can just go wild, and whatever you don't like later, you just carve away. So you really can't do too much wrong at this stage. Next up, we're going to build our false bottom. And a false bottom is essentially an island that you build within your vivarium or paludarium, and on top of this island is where your animals will live, and where you will have your substrate, your typical like cocoa fiber or whatever substrate you're using, and underneath the false bottom will be water. And the reason why you build these and why you don't just put, you know, the soil directly into the water is because with a false bottom, you actually allow water that you use for daily misting in your tank to basically rinse through the soil, therefore wetting the soil, therefore raising the humidity, and then the water that's left over will rinse through the false bottom and into your water reservoir down below. And we do this because the substrate that your animals live in and walk around in should never be constantly wet. It's just not healthy for the animals, and overall it can also make it so that the substrate rots, which is also not good. So that's the whole reason for this false bottom. There are a couple ways of building false bottom, but in this case I'm using the egg crate light diffuser method. So essentially this white plastic piece that you see, it's called an egg crate light diffuser, and you can buy it probably at every Home Depot. This 2 by 6 foot piece cost me $17 in my local Home Depot. Might be a little bit more, a little bit less where you live. And essentially I'm just marking out the pieces before I use some pliers to cut it. It's pretty hard plastic, so you will definitely need some pliers. You can probably use some scissors, although I imagine by cutting a lot of these little, crates, you'll be better off with pliers. Let me put it this way. But yeah, essentially you'll just see me measuring out all the pieces, and once I'm done with that, I'll tell you what to do next. Once you cut your pieces to size, you need some zip ties and a cat, preferably a Munchkin cat, but any cat will do. And yeah, you're going to basically build a false bottom box. I'm saying a box because usually people that use a false bottom, they will, use the piece where the soil lives on. So in this case, you can see this big plastic piece is where the soil will be on. And then they will build a frame around it that basically holds it up. And then that is it. But in my case, I'm actually making a completely locked box because I'm filling it with clay pebbles or hydropearls or whatever you want to call these things that you get at the garden store that keep the moisture very well. And the reason for this is, well, yes, it will keep the moisture, which is good if you need high humidity in your tank. But more importantly, in my case, it allows me to use less water to fill my paludarium/vivarium, because essentially the space that the pebbles take up would usually be consumed by water. And in this case, I'm keeping poison dart frogs in my vivarium, and they are very sensitive to the type of water that they live in. And reverse osmosis water is probably the best for them. And I only have a very limited supply or quantity of reverse osmosis water. Essentially, I believe I only have about 4 gallons in my under the sink, reverse osmosis system at any given time. So if I want to completely drain it or fill it up back up or whatever I want to do, I have to make sure that I do not use more than 4 gallons, because it takes several hours actually for the tank to refill. So it's just the way I'm using it. Again, you do not have to use these clay pebbles. You do not have to build a full box, but you will need at least the frame on the sides and a top piece where the soil will live on. And basically all you're going to do is you're going to zip tie everything together. Don't zip tie it down too hard, because then they can actually break and snap. So just tight enough so everything stays in place, and then the excess you just use the pliers again to cut off. And yeah, you'll just build a box, and you'll see that now. Next up, we're going to wrap the entire false bottom in some wheat liner. You can also use very thin mesh or netting or anything that basically keeps the substrate from falling through the egg crate and into the water where we do not want it. And we also need to make sure that whatever we use still allows water to drain through. So ultimately, the substrate will be on top of this black wheat liner, and once we mist it and it gets wet, the water is going to drip through the wheat liner because there's a ton of tiny little holes. But these holes are too small for the substrate, even something as small as cocoa fiber, to fall through. So yeah, we're just going to cut it to size and then wrap the whole thing in wheat liner. So here we're going to fill my false bottom with these clay pebbles that I mentioned before. Very important, wash them several times before you actually put them in your false bottom, because otherwise the water that you're putting in your vivarium will get very cloudy. They are very, very dusty, so clean them until the water that they're in comes out clear. And then very important, make sure that you order enough of them. Because in my case, I definitely didn't have as many as I thought I had or would need. And yeah, essentially it's just a very thin layer of clay pebbles, maybe a third of the height, half on a good day. And it's definitely not as many as I would have hoped. It will do the job. I mean, like I said, I'm only using it so that I need to fill the vivarium with less water, but I wish I had more of them. And then more importantly, I wish I had bigger ones, because some of these still fall through the egg crate, which is not a problem because everything is in the wheat liner, so they're actually I'm not losing any, but the problem is that they're getting caught between the egg crate and the wheat liner, and then it just looks like you have a very uneven mess, I guess, within your false bottom. And you can press these basically back through the egg crate, which is what I did. It takes time, it's a nuisance, and just buy bigger pebbles. I've seen some, they don't even have to be round, like some look more like rocks, more natural, and are definitely bigger, so I would recommend probably that type. But yeah, essentially, I'm now putting the cover on top of it. Like I said, I'm building a box, and I was hoping that the pebbles would stay in there, but essentially the reason why I'm building a box is because once I put it in the tank, I want to make sure that the pebbles stay underneath the egg crate and they're not going to float around anywhere in the tank. So that's why I'm building a box, and the entire thing is wrapped in the wheat liner, so nothing is going to fall out. And ultimately it worked out. It was just not as smooth as I was hoping it to be. Alright, and I'm going to finish part 1 of this Vivarium Paludarium build right here. Just to recap, we have started working on our background, we have put the sidewall in place with the spray foam, and we have built our false bottom, which will allow us to put substrate on later, and where our animals will basically walk around on. And I hope you found this informative so far, and you are going to check out part 2 of the series. And if you have any questions, either now or along the way, just put them in the comments and I will do my absolute best to get to them and answer them. And yeah, I hope I see you all in part 2.